Hey there, my name is Sam Okus. I am the editor-in-chief of Nation's Restaurant News. I am excited to bring to you a series of video interviews in conjunction with the NPD Group, a market research firm that is really keeping its finger on the pulse of consumer trends. Each month, we're going to bring to you a video interview with the NPD Group to dig into its data and review the state of the restaurant industry, which I think you can probably agree is pretty critical in this post-pandemic era. In today's interview, I am talking with NPD Group's Vice President and Industry Advisor for the food and food service industries, David Portalatin. We are going to talk in this interview specifically about how the pandemic recovery is going. We are going to talk about how the last year and a half has really affected consumer behavior and how restaurants have adjusted to that. And we're also going to dive into how back to school and workers going back to the office will affect restaurant performance in the coming months. Enjoy this interview between me and David Portalatin, NPD Group's Vice President and Industry Advisor to the food service industry. All right, David, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the status of the restaurant industry and specifically what you guys at the NPD Group are seeing in the data, in the numbers. I think it's fair to say we are I don't want to say post-pandemic. I don't want to play down. We've got some stuff going on with the Delta variant. We're still very much in it and should take this seriously. But as far as business goes, I think it's safe to say that the worst is behind us. And we're starting to look at how the industry is recovering. So let's kick off this conversation by just broadly talking about that recovery that's going on in the restaurant industry. What's the status? How is the industry recovering from really the depths of what we experienced last year?
Well, you're right. There's definitely a robust recovery underway. The question is, recovery to what? And so I would remind folks that in the 5 years pre-pandemic, total customer traffic at restaurants was relatively flat. So, when we talk about, we're going to get back to a 2019 level, that's pretty ambitious in the sense that, that 2019 was not a year that was a particularly great year in terms of overall growth. With that said, there's a lot of pent-up demand. There's a lot of people that want to get back out and go to restaurants. We're definitely seeing the traffic patterns improve. But over the last year or so, the American consumer has learned how to prepare more meals at home. If you look at the grocery sales data, for example, grocery sales are still up double digits versus 2 years ago. Now, the American consumer is not eating more food, so that means there's still a little bit of shift back toward the grocery aisle. Now, what's probably confusing to a lot of folks is that dollar sales at restaurants right now are very robust. In fact, we see dollar sales are about, especially for quick service restaurants, they're at about plus 8% versus a pre-pandemic number, back in 2019. So that's really great. But that reflects a couple of things. One is obviously restaurant prices are a little more expensive, but it also reflects the reality that when consumers do use restaurants, they're using restaurants differently now. It's more about that home meal replacement. So that's leading to a larger average party size. It's leading to a more complete meal solution approach to how we use restaurants. So the average ticket is growing in that respect. And this has especially been happening at quick service restaurants. And so the average check at quick service restaurants is up double digits. And so that's fueling a really robust recovery in terms of dollar sales. But I guess if I had to sum it all up, we are not yet back to a pre-pandemic level of actual customer visits. In fact, in the month of June, while we're plus 10% versus last year, we're still minus 7% versus June of 2019. So still a little more room for improvement.
That's so interesting because we've talked so much about consumer behavior for the last year and a half. I mean, so much of what the pandemic did was change consumer behavior. And what I'm hearing from you is it sounds like we're looking at maybe some permanent changes to consumer behavior. Because when you talk about from the QSR perspective of the dollars being up because check averages are up, maybe that's because people are doing more dinner time at QSR than lunch. Tell me about consumer behaviors. How do you see some of those things having changed and how it's playing into those data numbers you're talking about?
Yeah, well, some of these behaviors will be sticky and some of them will normalize to some degree. One of the driving factors, one of the reasons why we need all these in-home meal solutions is because everybody's at home more, whether it's work or school or whatever. And obviously, we expect some of those things to normalize. Let's take the back to work trend, for example. We estimate right now that there are about 58 million workers still working largely at home. Now that compares to maybe 5.5 million pre-pandemic. So we think that number will come down, but it's not going all the way back down to where it was. In fact, we think there could be anywhere from a range of somewhere between 15 to 30 million people who previously would have been working in an away from home office environment that will now work from home on a pretty consistent basis. So we expect some of these behaviors to moderate a little bit, but they're not ever going to completely go away. That's why we think the elevated behaviors you're seeing at drive-through windows, at delivery, at digital ordering, are all going to be with us at higher levels from here on out. Now, a lot of people talk about the return to experiences, and consumers are going back to ballparks and concert venues, and we're traveling again. Yes, that does include that differentiated on-premises dining experience. But it's really interesting. If we look at the June data, on-premises occasions at full service restaurants are still 30% below where they were in 2019. Not coincidentally, we find about 70% of consumers say, I'm comfortable eating out in public right now. So there's still a ways to go. Not everybody's ready to get back. And then I think we have to recognize that even in markets where restaurant operators are permitted to operate at 100% of their dining room capacity, they may be struggling to do so from two perspectives. One is just the labor and being able to fully staff 100% of that front of the house operation. And then the other is, many of these full service restaurant operators have developed a tremendous new capacity for curbside or drive-through or, other ways of facilitating off-premise consumption that they didn't have before. And all of that was a deployment of labor and resources. And they've got to figure out, how quickly or to what degree do we unwind that? So, these are some of the reasons that are keeping a lid on even more recovery in customer traffic. But we're definitely moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the full service restaurants in particular, because I do feel like there's a lot of positive news coming out about the full service industry today. Maybe that's partly because we spent all of 2020 with such negative news about the full service industry. And of course, the dining room closures hit that side of the industry especially hard. And for context, it's you got to put into context that the positive numbers for full service restaurants are over numbers last year that were just historically terrible. So the context being there. But I want to talk about this in terms of who is winning the post-pandemic momentum that's going on right now. Maybe not winning, but what categories, if we look at this a little bit more specifically, for some of this rebound, who especially is rebounding particularly well?
Sure. And let me just clarify too, when I said a moment ago that on-premises occasions are 30% below 2019, they're 86% above June a year ago. So yes, there are a lot of people who are really excited to go dine out again. I think you'll continue to see those numbers improve. But if you think about this broader transformation, the shift in consumer behavior, where it's all about at-home meal replacement. And let me first point out, this is not new. This was something that was happening pre-pandemic. In the 5 years pre-pandemic, off-premises traffic was outpacing on-premises traffic. More consumers were working from home. We had a larger percentage of consumers who don't participate in the workforce, either because of retirement or just the structure of this new on-demand economy and these kinds of things. So the consumer behavior was already changing. And now we fast forwarded 5 years into the future in a very short period of time, and we're going to maintain these things at a higher level. So when you think about that in terms of categories, well, what are the things that are suitable to crowd at home? And it ends up being traditional things like pizza, chicken, and some of the chicken sandwich wars that have been so successful at creating excitement among consumers have certainly played a role in that. And we've also seen burgers do very well. So these are things that, foods that are substantial, foods that are crowd pleasers, um, frankly, foods that make us feel good. Because one of the things we turn to restaurants for in this environment is, hey, we just want to feel better about things right now. That's one of the things that restaurants are just great at, is making us happy. And so those have been the three categories that have really done best overall. Now, with that said, you're certainly going to find top performers across a lot of different categories. So don't hear me saying you can't do well outside of burgers, chicken, or pizza. But in general, those have been the things, wings in particular, for example, that have really been the winners over the last year or so.
You also have hit on a couple of times this notion of how much people are working from home. And of course, a big part of the conversation last year, early in the pandemic, was around cities and what happened to cities when the pandemic hit. Of course, New York being prime example, but Chicago, I mean, we were talking about, I remember Chicago, there was this, I think it was like 2% occupancy in the office buildings there. So basically restaurants in the downtown business districts were really, I mean, just disappeared their business. As more people go back to work, what does that mean for cities and for restaurants, particularly in some of these more urban business districts? But to your point, not everybody's going back to work, perhaps ever. And so what should the expectation be there for some of that?
I think you will see, some normalization, some return to the city, some return to the central business districts and those kinds of things. But we did measure a very big migration away from some of the more densely populated urban areas. And I think some of that will have some permanence to it. It's why you see unevenness in the recovery across various parts of the country. Now, some of that has to do with areas where local government has been more restrictive for the restaurant industry. But in other cases, it's more geographic, and it's where people are moving to. That's why we see, if you look at things even just on a state or a DMA level, you may see a 30, 40 point gap in some parts of the country versus others in terms of the rate of the recovery. I think you're going to see a more permanent shift away from major markets into different climates, into different kinds of communities that are smaller, that offer a little more space and flexibility. And this may have an effect on where new restaurants get built in the future.
I'm curious too. We are gearing up for back to school season. August traditionally being very much that season where lots more extracurricular activities for families, and certainly it changes behaviors for consumers. They have different routines, all that. We did not have that experience last year for the most part. We did not have a back to school experience because of virtual schooling. I have this feeling that this year's back to school season is going to be a major indicator of where we're at in terms of getting past this pandemic, because of how significant it will be to get our kids back in the schools. But what does it mean for restaurant business because of the ways in which it changes consumer behaviors? What should we all expect to see with back to school season changing consumer behavior?
In addition to food and beverage consumption, our company studies 21 different industries, and we're talking about September timeframe being a major, significant event across all of retail, having an effect on consumer spending very broadly. It's, as you said, not only are public school aged kids more likely to be back on campus, but think about the college and university setting where you're going to have some sophomores actually experiencing their first sort of freshman year on campus. So think about a freshman class that's potentially double the size of what it would be. So there's going to be a lot of behavioral change. There's going to be a lot of investment around apparel and technology and all these other things to prepare us for this situation. And that also is likely to be an impetus for more people also returning to the workplace as we sort of get childcare things in the home straightened back out and sort of get back to a normal pattern. So yeah, we're looking at that September timeframe of being very pivotal. And of course, in terms of food and beverage, there's a lot to talk about. Even if we just limited the conversation to something like school lunch, pre-pandemic, the trend for school lunch was, kids were increasingly having this more snackable lunch where we just grabbed a collection of snack food items, put them in a lunch kit or a brown paper bag and off the door. Guess what happened over the last year? Mom and dad started making grilled cheese sandwiches and a hot bowl of soup, or we started going to our local QSR restaurant for a burger and these kinds of things at lunch. And the opportunity for marketers, I think, is how do you capture and hold on to some of those behaviors as we sort of turned back the clock and went back to some, maybe the kind of behaviors that previous generations would have had as a kid with either a homemade lunch or a more, traditionally composed meal from a restaurant, as opposed to this more snackable kind of meal composition. Now, again, I think you're going to see a sort of a blend of the two. You're going to see some people sort of revert back to these previous behaviors that with this trajectory that we were on before COVID came along. But I think you're going to see some folks hang on to the more traditional meal composition that we had before. And I think for restaurants, you're still going to see this heightened demand for that off-premise consumption, for that food that comes back into the home. And I think you're going to continue to see that the winners in the marketplace are the ones that are leaning into that best and are best in class with their digital engagement, whether that's for delivery or whether that's for pickup or at a drive-through. Those that are best in class at getting food back into where the consumer is, that's where I think you'll see the momentum.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You mentioned that in relation to the full service restaurants, but I think it's true across the board, this new muscle that has been built up by several companies, these new experiences that they have gone through, forced innovation is really what they had to do. And a lot of those things don't go away. And so if they developed a drive-through strategy, they've got that for long term now. If they developed a delivery platform, they've got that for long term. But, talking again about some consumer behaviors and how those have shifted. How should we expect in the near term that consumer behaviors will continue to dictate where the restaurant industry goes? As in this off-premises business, for those restaurants that have heard nothing but off-premise, should they still be focused on off-premises innovation? Because is that still going to be driving the bus here going forward for the restaurant industry?
There is always going to be a value in that unique, differentiated on-premises dining occasion. There's always going to be a role for that. And for full service restaurants, that will always be their bread and butter, the most important part of their business. I do think you're going to see a larger share of consumer occasions be off premises. And so this new muscle, as you described it, great way to describe it, that a lot of full service restaurant operators have developed, they're going to continue to want to retain some of that. They're not going to convert entirely to quick service restaurants, but I think you are going to sort of see this ongoing, call it a fast casualization of the full service dining space, where we make it easier for consumers to engage with the food on their terms and in a place that's meaningful for them. Are we still going to focus on that unique experience inside the restaurant? Absolutely, but I do think you'll see certain players revisit, how big does the dining room need to be? How much of our resources are we going to put against that versus, this pivot to other business models? And I think as a result, you're going to see new kinds of restaurant design coming up. You're going to continue to see things, for example, like this emergence of the virtual brand, where some full service restaurant chains who have increased capacity in the kitchen now have leveraged their digital capability to launch a new brand and fulfill out of an existing kitchen. So it's an exciting time. I think you'll continue to see some of that kind of innovation, but the off-premises piece is going to be a little bit bigger than it was before going forward.
I was having this conversation with colleagues recently, which is, last year I think there was, again, a forced innovation, but then there was also innovation by knee-jerk reaction, maybe you could say. I think we saw some of those prototype announcements, big companies coming out and saying, we're going to blow the lid off this thing with a new prototype. It's going to have, drive through and pickup and all that, lockers for pickup. And you've seen a lot of that slow down. A lot of those big ideas have, I think, kind of come back to reality. And it makes me wonder how much restaurants should be innovating against the pandemic versus just understanding that we're in a new normal now, and you're not necessarily having to innovate against the current events and what's going on with the pandemic. You can kind of settle into, I guess, understanding this is just how business is. Hopefully that makes sense. But I guess it is all to say, where should those innovation efforts be focused, and what kind of context should they have as they're innovating?
I look at research and I think of the big picture, and my job is to size things up and to make these proclamations like, digital and delivery and off premise is going to be bigger forever more than it was before. And, I feel strongly about that. But with that said, in the restaurant business, it always comes down to quality. The cost of a restaurant meal is higher than it's ever been. And if you're going to ask consumers to part with those hard-earned discretionary dollars to source a meal outside the home, it darn well better be something that I can't whip up myself. It darn well better be either a better experience or just an amazing quality, or some combination of the two. And so with that said, this is where restaurants really win, whether you're carving out a space as this unique dining experience, or whether you're really leaning hard into the grab it and go drive-through model. Your ability to differentiate from your competitor with the food itself always has been, always will be, the biggest competitive advantage in the marketplace for restaurants.
All right. So, David, last question. I know you're not an epidemiologist, so you can't exactly predict where we're going with this pandemic here. But barring a significant surge in COVID, how does the recovery play out? I think a lot of people are really eager to start talking about the Roaring '20s, and really eager to start talking about the recoveries here. And maybe it's been a little slower than they expected. How do you see this going forward over the course of the next 6 months and then a year? Again, barring any significant surges in COVID.
And thank you for acknowledging I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't play one on TV, and I did not sleep at Holiday Inn Express last night. So we're out of that business altogether. But let's face it, the news headlines right now are not as encouraging as you would like them to be. And I think we have to acknowledge that our June measurements are a little softer than May. Now, we don't think that we're heading back the other direction. We're still optimistic on restaurant recovery. But I think it's going to be slow and steady. I don't think you're going to see this overnight, explosion where we eclipse 2019 just like that, and we're rip roaring and growing again. It's going to be a while. We think that by the end of 2022, we're still likely to be in an environment where total customer transactions at restaurants are still not quite back to that 2019 level. And with that said, you're going to see some sectors that certainly do better than that. Quick service restaurants will probably close that gap to 2019 by the end of next year. We would acknowledge that there are certain individual restaurant operators right now that are already, double digits ahead of that pre-pandemic level, because they're doing things that are either just outright excellent, or they're really leaning into some of these consumer shifts that we talked about, or probably some combination of the above. So you're going to see pockets of growth where the recovery is much more robust. But in total, we think we're looking at, through the end of 2022 before we start talking about approaching that 2019 level yet. Slow and steady till then.
Yeah, it's longer than maybe we had all hoped, but I think there's reasons to be optimistic. So, David, thank you so much once again for joining us. I really appreciate your time today and appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.